Good morning, everyone. Good to have you here. Welcome to those in the room. Welcome to those here through the magic of digital communication. I'm Matt Skinner, and this is another edition of, or another presentation in our series of Thinking Critically, Living Biblically, attending to Scripture in a complex modern world. And today's topic, demons and the demonic. Why not? Number of reasons for this. One is last year when we were walking through the Newer Testament, this was a question that came up multiple times. People asked for a little bit more treatment of this. If you don't know, there are a number of scenes in the Gospels where Jesus casts out demons, or sometimes called unclean spirits, from people. It also gets into bigger questions around the nature of evil. How do we talk about evil and sin in our world? What is our own responsibility? It also matters in some ways for conversation today. There are some strands of Christian nationalism in the country right now that are very animated by questions of angels and demons. And when you start to identify everybody who disagrees with you as demonic, it can make it a lot easier to just push your agenda forward or not be too concerned about conversation. I'm not sure that's the dominant stream, but it is out there. And so this is something that we hear about. So Margaret and I drew straws, and I got to teach on demons and the demonic. Yeah, I'm not going to say whose straw it was or who wanted it. There's a lot we could talk about with this. But first, how about an announcement? So Lent is coming up, and at Westminster during Lent, we switch things up a little bit. So instead of meeting in here as a large group for 5 weeks, there will be small groups that meet. Some of them meet Sunday mornings, some of them meet on Wednesdays. We call it Church in the Round, so it's an opportunity to be matched up with folks in small groups. I think roughly 8 to 12 people. So a chance to make the church feel a little smaller, get to know some other people, and to be in conversation around topics related to our spiritual life. So this year the theme is solace, solitude, and solidarity. Alliteration, very good, well done there. And here's the blurb. Through study guides, discussion questions, and prayer, groups will explore what it means to be in deep relationship with God, ourselves, and others, especially as we seek hope in the midst of a fraught and challenging time. So these weekly gatherings will take place either Sunday mornings at 9:15. There'll be opportunities both in person or for online groups if you prefer that way, or if you live at a distance. There will be groups Wednesdays at 12:30 in the afternoon, so you could come and partake in the Lenten midday services and then be in a small group. Also, I believe, in person or online. And then Wednesday evenings at 6:30, there will be groups, I believe, also in person or online. If you want to sign up, I'm hoping this works. The QR code, it worked on my screen, but now that I blow it up, okay, I'm getting a thumbs up. You can sign up here. There's also, you can sign up on the Realm app. There'll be ways to sign up at tables, I believe, the next few Sundays. There's cards on the table. Perfect. So purple cards on the table. All sorts of ways to sign up, whether you are want to do it digitally or analog, whatever you prefer. So looking forward to this. There are still small groups in existence in this church that began as Church in the Round groups or its predecessor group that people got together and talked and realized they liked each other and built friendships. It happens. And some groups meet for 5 weeks, and they're like, that's been great. But yeah, Ken. 2008. That's 18 years ago. That's fantastic. Good. So great opportunity. And if you're thinking, well, I can't be here for 5 weeks, I have a busy schedule, that's fine. If you can make it 4 weeks, 3 weeks, your group would still love to have you. So think about that. All right. So here we go. Let's talk about demons and the demonic. So my question is, what kinds of biblical scenes or activities or teachings come to mind when you think of the devil? So there's a hint already here on the screen in terms of a particular biblical scene. Doris has the microphone if you want to mind circulating, Doris. Just kind of anything on the top of your head that you might have heard of, even if it's not specific, but kind of a general idea. What are scenes or ideas in the Bible that seem to connect with the devil or Satan, whatever?
Good morning, everybody. I'm thinking back to my first grade in Roman Catholic grammar school where the good sister was teaching us about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And she was on the chalkboard and she says, I'm going to say something kind of nasty. The devil appeared. And she draws this figure with no face, but like this cape-like vampire.
Yeah.
And that is, when I think of the devil, even to this day, at age 72, that's the first image that comes to mind.
Yeah, it made an impression. Which is interesting, the story in Genesis there with the serpent in the garden. The serpent's never identified in that story as the devil. It's just this wily creature, but has often then been merged. It's interesting.
Hi.
Yep.
This isn't biblical, but you're old enough, maybe. The devil made me do it. Who said that? Do you remember?
Flip Wilson, I believe, the comedian, had a whole bit, right, about everything he did wrong in his life was the devil made me do it, right?
Well, this is one that I think is sort of biblical and sort of not. But as a child, I was intrigued by this war, the angels that decided to gang up on God and go to war with God and then got kicked out of heaven. Mm-hmm. And maybe you can illuminate us, Matt, on how much of that is biblical and how much comes from somewhere else.
Really, none of it is biblical. A couple of teachers drew on some biblical text to try to say, yeah, this notion of fallen angels, you might have heard, who were cast out of heaven, who turned on God, and this revolt of some kind. And that, so one of the names for the devil is Lucifer, which simply means a light bearer. It's this idea he was once once on the good side, and so that's, which also is interesting. How we think about evil, right? Is evil always a turning away from the good, or is evil just somehow ingrained? I mean, it ties into some of the ways we try to make sense of criminality and things like that in our world. So, for sure.
I think of the demons that were possessed by the man, and Jesus, yes, into pigs and who ran over the cliff.
Yeah, there's a great story we'll look at later where there's a man who's possessed, and Jesus sends these spirits into pigs who then drown themselves into the water. It's this terrifying scene. But there's several places where Jesus casts out demons from people as well. There's Ken in the back. Nobody said the one that's on the screen. Maybe it's too obvious, but.
I hope it's not the one on the screen. Mary Magdalene theoretically had demons cast out of her, if I have it right.
Yeah, in Luke chapter 8, the reference to Mary Magdalene is that she had 7 demons cast out of her, and of course that number 7 gets people excited sometimes. Like, what does that mean? Is that like a complete or a full amount of demons, or what would that? Yeah, numbers in the Bible get people very excited. So. I love it when people have to walk like the full length of the room. This is great.
I'll do the one on the screen.
Excellent.
So Jesus being tempted by the devil, all of this I will give you if you bow down to me.
Yeah, there's 3 of the Gospels have this scene where Jesus is driven by the Holy Spirit into the wilderness, where he has this confrontation. This is always a great scene to watch, like in Jesus films, how they're going to portray this, like what's the devil like. But 2 of the Gospels have these 3 different temptations that Jesus has to resist. So, and here's one of them, right, where the devil shows him all of the kingdoms of the world and says, if you just bow down to me, they can all be yours. Okay. The devil does have wings in this one, yeah. And I think some horns, yeah.
I don't know where this is, but even the idea that even the devil is under the reign of God. Old Testament, is that this? Sorry, you're going to have to tell me in the Old Testament.
I'm going to have to tell you what you're thinking? No. I'm not going to do that, Sheila. No. Well, so maybe one of the things you might be thinking about is in the book of Job, we're told that Satan comes and says, God is like, have you seen Job? He's the best. And Satan's like, yeah, that's just because he's prosperous and healthy. But if I were to strike him down, you would see he would not be so faithful. And God says, okay, you have permission to do this. So it's this idea that the devil, or that Satan is only allowed to do what God permits. But even then, that the term Satan it's a Hebrew word, Satan, which just means accuser. in Hebrew, and so it appears that he doesn't appear to be evil, like forked tail and horns and things like that. He appears to be kind of this prosecuting attorney, so to speak, who kind of is in God's court. So that's interesting. That's the way he appears in the Old Testament. But you've also got, I think Luther said, even the devil is God's devil or something like that. And so you've got theologians who are very uncomfortable with the idea of good and evil, or God and Satan, as two equally opposed forces in the universe, and really want to make sure God is all powerful, which then means, well, who controls the devil, and why hasn't God wiped the devil out? You see what I mean? There's this interesting problem that a lot of theologians find themselves wrestling with around that kind of question. Yeah, Paul.
In the Lord's Prayer, there's a definite article before the word evil, and some translations translate it, and I think isn't a bad translation in part, the evil one, rather than just this broad kind of evil. It's personified into a force or an evil one.
Yeah, so we pray that every time we're in church on most days, here at least, right? So lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. But it's a legitimate translation is deliver us from the evil one. And so is that a reference to Satan, if we're going to personify that as well? Yeah. So there it is. There's some of the scenes that we get. Thanks, Doris, for doing that. One of the things we have to do then when we take some of this biblical material, I think is to be kind of clear. This is my favorite image of Jesus in the wilderness, by the way, from the 15th century. This isn't how I imagine the testing in the wilderness, but sorry, some of you won't sleep well tonight. But it's kind of like, you know, some of those movies from the 50s, like the guy in the lizard suit. You know, it kind of reminds me of that. But anyway, sorry, you have to have a sense of humor to work with the Bible, I think. We need to be clear about what we're talking about with the question, right? We could be looking at this question historically, which is, where do these ideas come from? How did Judaism get them? Like, how did the religion develop over time? And where does this come from? First, is there significant differences between the two testaments? In the Older Testament, there's very little reference to Satan or to demonic beings. When we get to the Newer Testament, reference to the devil show up all over the place in all different kinds of writings, mostly in the Gospels, but also in most of the other, all the other kinds of literature in the Newer Testament. In the Older Testament, there's no consistent or simple kind of understanding of demons and their nature, right? They're very infrequent, and they're relatively scattered, right? When they are mentioned, they have to do with kind of various evil spirits that might be associated with things like illnesses or plagues, or the worship of other gods, kind of a way of describing what makes the world go bad. But there's not a lot of attention given to trying to kind of sort or organize what they're talking about. And there's no apparent connection between these malevolent spirits in the Older Testament and this idea of Satan as well. It's just not connected the way it is in the Newer Testament. So if you flip the page, you go from the Older Testament to the Newer Testament, you're jumping ahead in time, several hundred years, for the most part, with the exception of, maybe one book or some parts of books in the Older Testament. You're jumping ahead several hundred years, and all of a sudden you start reading the Gospels, and there's an assumption that everybody knows what the devil is, everybody knows what demons are. Like, the New Testament doesn't slow down and try to explain them. It just assumes that you know who these folks are, or what these things are. And so the question is, what happened between the Older Testament and the Newer Testament? Nobody in the Newer Testament spends much time kind of speculating about the origins of evil, the whole story about the fall or things like that came up earlier. No real talk about that, a tiny, tiny bit, but again, it's mostly assumed. In the Gospels, there's almost an understanding that the whole world is under a kind of satanic dominion. I mean, Jesus comes into the world, and it's a place of conflict, right? He has to do battle with the devil in the wilderness and these demon-possessed people, or the demons within certain people. And so it's an interesting leap in terms of what's going on. It's a fascinating question of trying to determine what's changing in Judaism between the two testaments. Here's the part that's not fun. There's no consensus among scholars about where this came from exactly. Some have thought it might have roots in a Persian religion called Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism was, here's the nickel summary, pretty much a dualistic religion where there's a good or benevolent God and an evil, malevolent God, and they're always at war, and there's a kind of balance in the universe between good and evil. And some thought that that was kind of something that Judaism borrowed as a way of trying to make sense of why do horrible things sometimes happen? How come people lose control of themselves? How come the world can be so violent in some ways? Others have thought this came from the influx of Greek society and just how do you explain all of the gods that the Greeks have? And kind of one of the assumptions was, well, those are things with power, but they're not the God. And so there are these other kinds of power. We do have access to some Jewish texts that were written between the Testaments. And again, there's no real clear agreement in how to talk about these things. There's a variety of terminology. So Satan, the devil, I mentioned Lucifer earlier. Beelzebul is a term we see in the Newer Testament. It means Lord of the Dung Heap, which is a great name if you're looking for a name to give a pet or something like that. Beelzebul is a good one. There's a book called First Enoch that says that demons came about as a kind of unholy union between angels and human beings. There's a very tiny little story in the first 4 verses of Genesis chapter 6 that talks about angels cohabitating, falling in love with, and cohabitating is the nice word, with human women and creating this race of monsters, these giants and things like that. It's in there. I don't know if your teacher got to that in Genesis 6 after Genesis 3, but this little weird kind of mythical thing. And so things like that have kind of led people's imagination, but we honestly can't tell exactly like where this arises from. One thing that's very interesting is that period between the Testaments is largely a time of where Jews are living under a kind of imperial subjugation, different empires coming in, some ruling relatively gently, but some being very, very heavy-handed. And it's at this same time where this kind of belief in unclean spirits or of demons or of a real malevolent power in the universe rises up as well. So that's one question. We're interested historically, where does this come from? We could also address the question theologically, right? Every religion has to contend with the question of where does evil come from. Every philosophy has to contend with the question of where does evil come from. Every society has to ask that question, right? And so we seek a number of different solutions, but religions usually have some kind of a theological question. Are we asking the question of the origins of evil? Where did it come from? If God is loving, why do people do bad things? Right? Those kinds of questions. Is God the only kind of power that holds this universe together, or are there other ones? How much power does God have? Is God's power fully, has God scripted everything? Is the devil God's devil, or is there, right, or is God at war with things? More closer to home questions, right? What damages people and their moral sensibility? Some of you are probably psychologists or psychiatrists, right, who've had to ask these kinds of questions, right? What is it that breaks people? What is it that destroys the capacity for empathy in some people? What is it that destroys our morality, right? As a society, we often get really uncomfortable with those questions and develop places to put people who we can't quite explain, right? And or develop laws or things like that, right? There's this problem of what do you do with people who seem to have lost a kind of moral center? What does that look like? What does that mean when we talk about damage and responsibility? Is it the devil made we do it? Are there ways in which some people lose a kind of moral footing because they've had it taken from them in the way in which they've been treated, right? So there's psychological questions. There are sociological questions. There are probably medical and chemical questions that we have to ask as well, right? All of the ways in which this is bound up in a bigger question of how come some people just seem to go wrong? And how come sometimes really good people do things that are just horrible for whatever reason? And what happens when there are massive social movements, right? We've lived through enough of these in our lifetime. Even the last 100 or 200 years has given us enough to realize that sometimes human beings create oppressive systems that seem to be more than just the sum of our bad decisions or more than just the bad of our selfishness, right? I've read enough things from Holocaust survivors, right, that the way people reflect on the horrors of human history raise these questions. So we're looking at this historically, we're looking at it theologically. There are also moral questions. What's the right way to discuss this topic and to make judgments about illnesses, motives, struggles, and the damages that people inflict? Those are important questions, right? What happens when somebody labels somebody else demonic? Like, is that a fair assessment? Like, what does that do in terms of dehumanizing a person or something like that? I worry about the risk of excusing sin. If we're too excited to use language about the devil, does that do away with our responsibility? The devil made me do it, right? Can we just say like, oh, I guess you're not responsible for the harm you inflicted. For some sins or some crimes, we might say that, but certainly not for all of them. There's also the risk of simplifying complicated oppression, right? The way in which we can talk about social systems and economic systems that just do harm to people, to certain people, that can't break out of. People experience as a kind of force that compels them. We could talk about other things, right? I mean, we could go into detail about things like addiction and what happens when somebody doesn't feel fully in control over their own choices, and how do we understand those things medically? What happens when you now start accusing people of having a demon of rebellion, right, or a demon of addiction, as you might hear in some churches? There's the risk of inflicting greater suffering on people. Every now and then you'll find in the news, if you read the news for weird biblical stories, you'll find horrible accounts of people in churches who have determined that somebody is possessed by a demon and will try to cast that demon out and will just do tremendous harm physically, sometimes even kill people in the process of these, kind of exorcisms that people are doing. So there's a way in which talking about this runs the risk of making a problem worse, right, for people who are suffering. There's the danger of weaponizing the topic. I read recently that Erica Kirk recently said that she thinks that all of the protests against ICE activity in America is being fueled by demonic influence. Well, how do you respond to something like that? No, it's not. Back at you. I mean, yeah, it becomes like, what are you going to do with that? Like, what do you do with a statement like that, right? Well, of course you think that way because you're demonic. I mean, it's just, right, this is not helpful language. And so a lot of times, and for good reason, churches try to avoid this language because it can lead into this. So my goal today is not to answer the historical question. We could spend time looking at all sorts of ancient Jewish texts and going, that's interesting, that's weird, here's a weird exorcism story. I don't want to do that, really. I do want to talk a little bit theologically about what's going on, but I want to keep this moral question also in front of us, right? What's the value of talking about this, if anything? But the Bible talks about it, and I'm a Bible scholar, so I have to deal with this question from time to time. And I want to take evil seriously. Again, consider the movements, the developments, the systems, the politics that have done mammoth damage to human life and to environmental flourishing, right? The ways in which human beings seem really good at destroying ourselves and one another in ways that seem to exceed the sum of all of the dumb decisions we might make, right? People who study these kinds of things will talk about the need to think seriously about what we talk about when we talk about evil. I'm often asked the question, do I believe in the devil and demons? I think sometimes it's a test. I think people are trying to figure out, like, just how superstitious is he or just how rational is he? I usually just shrug my shoulders and say, I have no idea what to think about them, which people don't always like. I think it's the wrong question. I think, do you believe in the devil is the wrong question, personally, because I think it's a question that doesn't get us very far. All it does is get us to a kind of metaphysical decision, right? What do you think is out there? I don't know. What is? I mean, I have some ideas. I have a faith in some things, but I'm not sure we have the information we need to answer that question. I'm not sure it's a helpful question. I would rather talk about what are the evils or the temptations in our lives that traditionally the Bible has ascribed to the devil. For me, that gets us a little bit further. Is the devil a person? I don't know. I don't find that helpful. Is the devil a reality? Well, now I'm kind of interested, right? Because that gets me asking questions about evil and harm and what does it mean to be a well person and what does it mean to follow God faithfully. So that's where I want to go. When we get to the question, what are we looking for here? I'm interested in the question of what are the things that harm human existence, that harm human flourishing, that seem to be ingrained sometimes into the ways in which we live. I'm really helped by a recent book by a Scottish scholar, or at least a scholar at a Scottish university, named Philip Ziegler, called God's Adversary and Ours, A Brief Theology of the Devil. It's about 120 pages. It assumes you know some stuff. It's a thick read, but it's not a long read. But he's got a really interesting point that I find helpful and I'm going to follow this morning. He says that too much theological attention in the history of the church has been devoted to chasing answers about the devil's origins and nature. Right? Tracking the question, where did the devil come from? If there is a devil, where does the devil reside? And how much power does God have vis-a-vis the devil? You read medieval theology, this is what people want to talk about, right? The historical question, where did it come from? How should we be thinking about this? What does this mean for God? Ziegler says instead, if we read the Bible, and when the Bible does mention the devil or diabolical influence, the Bible is much more interested in questions, what does the devil do, specifically in connection to Jesus and Jesus's ministry? I find that really, really helpful, right? Because the focus is not on the devil, does the devil exist, but rather, what are the diabolical actions and forces in the world? What are the things that make life hard? What are the things that turn us away from following Jesus? And so Ziegler's got 3 points. My bullets didn't come through just right here. He says what we see the devil operating in the Bible, particularly in the Newer Testament, are typically around temptation, oppression, and falsehood. And I like that because I can see those things in my own life. Right? These are all things I can deal with as opposed to some of these bigger, metaphysical questions. What does he mean by this? He says these are the ways the devil shows up in Jesus' ministry in the Gospels. He says all 3 of these show ways in which there are forces in the world that try to derail human flourishing. And they're all 3 ways in which we have to be reminded that struggle is a part of the life of salvation, right? Faith isn't easy. Following God isn't always easy. It's not for me, at least. So by temptation, this is talking about more than just wanting the extra slice of cake, right? An extra glass of wine or something like that. This is, for Ziegler, consider the stories of Jesus when he's in the wilderness. We talked about one of those. We'll look at one in just a minute. If you know that story, or those stories, Luke chapter 4 and Matthew chapter 4 are the long ones. In those stories, what the devil tries to do is to draw Jesus away from how he's going to live out his purpose. Right? Instead of living in submission to God, instead of living a life of kind of more quiet power, right, where he's amongst people, he's healing people, the devil says, why don't you throw yourself off the temple and let the angels catch you, right? Put on a spectacle, let people be amazed by your power. Right? Instead of going and following this path, it's going to lead you to a cross. Why not just worship me now, and you can have dominion over all of the nations of the world? Seize power, right? Rule your way with nobody to get to be an obstacle to that. Why not turn stones into bread? Why not solve the problems right now that beset people just through a simple wave of the hand, right? And Jesus chooses a different path in all of these. In other words, the devil in these passages is against things like humble self-giving, and he's in favor of dominance. The devil also in these passages keeps quoting scripture to Jesus, at least a couple of times, which is really interesting. Maybe a reminder that some of these diabolical forces aren't out there, but they're among us, right? The ways in which we talk about God carries an inherent risk to it, right? We are always tempted to go and seize power. We're always tempted to go and choose other ways of following Christ. Oppression, and for Ziegler, these are now the stories of people who are possessed by spirits in the Gospels. Again, we can talk a lot about where some of this possession language came from, but here, these are stories about the kind of stuff that leads human beings into misery. Right? People who, for some reason, have lost control over themselves and their decisions, who, as a result, have become separated from community and separated from others. These are the kinds of things, whatever it is, that destroy lives and families, communities, society, and creation. Whatever the opposite of health is or sustenance is, these possession stories seem to encapsulate that. Right? So again, it's this power against, right? Temptation, the power against the values Jesus attempts to live out in the Gospels. And oppression now, it's this power against the kinds of things that create human flourishing or lead to human flourishing. Then the third one, falsehood, lies. Here you've got some stories. There's a particular story in John, where Jesus accuses the devil of being kind of the chief of all lies, right? Of being a liar, a force of deception. What are the things that erode trust among us, right? What are the things that make it really difficult to understand the true nature of somebody else, right? Or of the world as a whole? What are the things that make community impossible? The things that make advocacy impossible? The things that make love impossible? This sounds kind of weird and strange until you realize, right, all of you in your pockets have got a machine that's feeding you information through an algorithm that, right, is trying to shape you, and in some cases maybe trying to deform your capacity to form community or your capacity to form empathy, depending upon what apps you're on and what profile has been built of you, right? I'm not saying that your phone is the devil, but, right, we understand there are forces that are always kind of at work trying to erode truth and honesty in our world. So that's, I find that helpful from Ziegler, right? As how do we talk about diabolical things in the world, which again is what I would much rather talk about than like, is there a devil and does he have horns, and did I listen to too much heavy metal back in the 70s and 80s, and has that done something to me? Just because I knew it was bad, Sheila, like I knew I wasn't supposed to. You know what I mean? Yeah. I think that was just a way for bad musicians to sell albums. It's like, you know what? We're kind of good, but if we start, putting 666 on our album covers, people are going to buy us. And I think that's what happened to me. But true confessions here, right? It's all about honesty. Let's get rid of the lies. So anybody else? Anybody else got a few albums in their history you don't want to share about? All right. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Questions here. I just dropped a lot on us. I want to look at some texts, but I want to make sure we can check in. Doris has got the microphone.
Thank you. There's been a YouTube channel sponsored by public television of a literature professor who studies the culture of monsters around the world. And one of she does them country by country or mythological creature by creature, but it seems like the overall theme is everywhere in the world there seems to be some monster in people's cultures. And I think her conclusion is that fear and the things in the world that frighten us or go wrong, we want to personify it. Mm-hmm. And is this likewise what we do when we talk about the devil?
Yeah. I think so. That's why I'm more comfortable talking about forces. What are the forces that beset us that we can't always name? And but I like that about monsters, right? So whether it's dangerous places, graveyards, the forest, the spots where it's not safe to be, is part of our way of trying to maybe corral or to gain control over some of these things that haunt us. But Ken.
I want to ask whether or not in this book he talks about, I don't want to say, corporate evil. Somehow, Richard Rohr has a book, What Do We Do with Evil? And one of the things he says is the church, and he's talking about the Catholic Church, has focused a lot on personal evils. He said that was the easy way out. What we don't look at is how good people end up being caught up. And I don't just mean the big, Holocaust. Does Ziegler bring that in, or how would you join those things, individual versus?
Yeah, he does a little bit, mostly in talking about how we have to take this seriously, that this can't just be, here are the list of bad things people do, but we need to talk more systemically. but he's not as much as like you're saying with Rohr. There's also an author named Walter Wink who wrote, goodness, maybe 30 years ago or so now, had several books about what he called the powers. One I think was called like Unmasking the Powers, one's like Naming the Powers, and he did a lot to take a lot of the traditional language about evil or the devil or temptation as an individual thing, right? I'm tempted to cut corners or cheat or elevate myself, whatever your personal favorite sin is, to talking about how that gets embedded systemically, right? The kinds of things that make it impossible for people to break out of poverty or racism. Again, the stuff that we have woven into our life together so deeply we don't know how to disentangle that. Like Wink talks about that as these powers. And so it's more, I think, sociological for him than anything else. I don't think he's like a political scientist, but kind of a theologian who's done some sociology. He's been very helpful, very influential for a lot of this. I mean, listen to it in our prayers of confession on a Sunday morning, right? Sometimes those will try to balance the things that I can hear and go, oh yeah, I do that. Oh yeah, that's me. And sometimes the things that are much bigger. Environmental degradation. How do I participate in that? Well, I drove here. I mean, I do every day. How do I disentangle myself from that is much more difficult, right? But it's also part of what it means to, quote unquote, sin, right? Or to seek forgiveness from before God. I think a good prayer of confession tries to balance those, right? The things that we all are kind of individually responsible for, but also the stuff that's just part of being, an American with cars and the ability to travel and to buy stuff and those types of things. Does that help, Ken, just kind of tease some of that out a bit more? Oh, yeah, sorry.
Okay, so I'm not sure if you touched on this, but older religions throughout the world and time, is there tending to be a theme similar to Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or whatever that would also have this theme of evil in them or the devil? Do you know if that's true? Is this just man doing his thing? Our thing?
Yeah, I don't know enough about kind of, especially modern world religions, to talk about how they all view evil. Like I know very little about how Islam, for example, speaks about a devil or not, and which Mustafa were here, he would set us straight. Judaism, it kind of depends who you're talking to, but Judaism as well, at least the Jews I know and I've talked to about this, would get kind of stuck in the same place a lot of us do. Like, is this a personified being or not? Is it more helpful to talk about the forces of evil or diabolical things? Kind of more helpful for the most part. In the ancient world, everybody believes in spirits somewhere, some way. So, I mean, we read the Gospels and think, my goodness, what an animated universe. But that's pretty much everybody. So even the word demon that in English we get from daimonia in Greek, which is already being used way before the time of Jesus. The daimonia in Greek philosophers were the things that influence you, like the emotions that can seize control of you. Right? Whether that's, lust or passion or greed or something like that. Different philosophers would name that as a demon. Now, they didn't mean it had horns or anything like that. It was just, there are things that can take control of you in the world. Sometimes they're gods or spirits. Sometimes they're these, I keep using the word emotions, I guess it's the best word, or tendencies that kind of run out of control. And so then in the Jewish world, they pick up that word demon and say, oh, those are our unclean spirits. So even the New Testament, sometimes they're called demons, sometimes they're called unclean spirits. There's some other terms as well. So there's a real wide variety of terminology there. So it's just simply to say that this is part of the ancient world. Like very few ancients thought that the world just went kind of on its own, on its own pattern, right? There's a whole world of unseen things that are influencing us all of the time. Now, I don't believe that. I think human beings have much more autonomy, but I also think sometimes there's evil at work among us, however we want to name that, again, sociologically, psychologically, spiritually, whatever. Does that does it help? So so Jews weren't weird in their time for believing this. In fact, in some ways, they were trying to catch up to a lot of their neighbors who had a very kind of bigger, vaster understanding of spiritual beings. So you see some of that in Greek myths as well. I mean, some of the gods are just mean and terrible. They're all self-centered and egotistical. They're kind of, all the Greek gods are reflections of humanity's own worst tendencies. But they tend to be very dangerous. You don't want them around because they're going to mess with your life. Sorry, I'm so I just, you don't always wake up in the morning saying, I can't wait to talk about evil for an hour. I'm just a little thrown.
So I've found in my adulthood that in times of stress, the 23rd Psalm always comes back to me and tends to dominate my thinking and my making mantras to get through it, and that's been very true, especially for the past few weeks. And in line with this, in the 23rd Psalm, the only real evil that is mentioned is death. Yea, though I walk through death's dark vale. But then there's also oppression, I think, because a table thou hast furnished in presence of my foes. And in that, at that table, the Lord anoints me, and my cup overflows. And it's sort of a lesson to those who are your foes, but it's also, they're at the table with you. And God's love is overflowing for everybody, but you're part of it. And to me, I find so much symbolism in that psalm that it comforts me.
Yeah.
His rod and staff, me comfort still.
I appreciate that. There are places, Isaiah, I think, personifies death as well. You know, talk about personifying something that's a threat. There are other ancient gods that saw, religions that saw that saw death as a god, as an actual thing that was out there, swallowing up souls. So, I mean, the personification is helpful, especially in that psalm, I think, how we understand the threats in this world. Joy.
From the live stream, and some of these came in a while ago, but when I was a parish nurse, a parishioner warned me that what looked like illness might be actually possessed by a demon. And to your comment of, well, why are some people just seem bad? The comment came back, maybe we should ask, why are people good? How does mental illness relate to the topic? And then a reference to C. Scott Peck's People of the Lie.
Yeah. Don't read Scott Peck's book at night. That's an old book from like the 70s. He was a psychotherapist who wrote a book and just basically kind of talks about some of his patients that he could not help and could not really diagnose, people who just seemed morally injured beyond repair, which is terrifying. But again, people who are psychologists would know more about that than I do, for sure. But I hear these stories. I hear stories like that from students who work in certain places. I had lunch with an FBI agent one time who worked profiling serial killers. That was terrifying, talking about what do you do with a person who seems to have lost their humanity because they literally have no capacity for empathy. I just can't understand that their violence would somehow have a more, I mean, so these are not I hope that you don't live next door to these people, but these are people that push the question, right? So some of the stories, let me answer this one another way. Some of the stories of possessed people in the Gospels appear to be suffering from symptoms that we might have other explanations for. My father, when he was alive, was epileptic, for example. Some of the things that happen in certain stories sound a lot like somebody having a grand mal seizure, in my experience. Right, we know more of what causes something like that, right? Neurologists can help us with that. We can treat that medically, right? So I still would strongly urge all of you, when something goes wrong, go to a doctor first before an exorcist, right? That there's, but there was still a sense that that was something in my father's life that he could not control on his own, which was just a thing, right? But it didn't make him a sinful person or a bad person. Some of the stuff around mental illness and some of the Gospels with people speaking other voices or seeming to have kind of multiple voices within them. Again, I'm not a psychologist, but right, we have explanations for that. At least we have ways of diagnosing that are different, which is one of the reasons why there's a moral edge to this, right? To not say some of the people who might look ill could be demonic. That's never my first choice. So I don't know if that kind of gets at it, right? Or yeah, that's the only wisdom I have on that. Doris, can you go in the back? Sorry. You look so comfortable. Yeah. I mean, this is one of the places where there is we can see kind of people in the Bible maybe doing the best they could with what they knew at the time. I think we know a little better, a lot better in terms of, again, psychological, some medical diagnoses. But there is still a problem of the things that put us at war with ourselves, right? Or that degrade our capacity to enter into relationships with others. Some of which we can treat, some of which we cannot.
I read a paper, I actually did a little work on it, and it was from a neurologist and a psychologist. And this was back during the COVID and Trump's first term. And it was all about how our brain literally develops, all of us. We develop slowly, and we develop little, boxes of what is what. And then if we evolve, we're able to go across those boxes and critically think. And sometimes even the most brilliant people are still in those little boxes. And somehow that has given me not, comfort, but it helps me understand how people get so lost, because they've just never been able to they get stuck in the box. And the ability to go through the parts of their brain, which I believe is critical thinking, where you can move from one to another, they just don't have that ability. Mm-hmm. No matter how intelligent they are, they don't have that ability. So I don't know if that makes any sense. But when you get stuck, that's when I think when true evil can find you and attack you. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. I think that what I hear in that is a kind of, this is a bigger question than just an hour in a church, right? We need neurologists in the room, we need psychologists in the room, we need doctors in the room, all those types of questions. But also a kind of a humble recognition that we don't understand humanity as well as we might think we do. But also we probably know people or have been in the experience where people just kind of get stuck, and some of that's around development, around complex ways of thinking, but some of that's moral as well. Again, people who have got a damaged morality. The question is, does that just happen? Is that done to people? And so are people acting out of their own damage? Either way, it's still a kind of evil to me. Not saying that person is evil. One of the things that's really interesting about the New Testament stories of possession is the person who's possessed is never regarded as evil. See what I mean? It's like they're never considered to have kind of done something wrong. They're considered to have been taken over by something outside of themselves, which I find really remarkable, right? That there's a kind of, no, it's not you. It's the evil that got a hold of you. Do you see what I mean? Be a lot easier just to say these were bad people who did bad things. Now they got what they deserved by being possessed. And there's never, in the Gospels, there's never that kind of a statement as well.
I have one more comment from the
please,
live
Joy.
stream. I always wondered about the Romans passage that says, "For I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities," and this word is in all caps, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Jesus Christ our Lord.
Yeah.
So comments on principalities?
Yeah, so that's a great line there in Romans 8. It sometimes is taken as some kind of spiritual force, things that are out there in the world. I mean, Paul seems to have a view of the universe that's very lively. There are all kinds of beings and forces out there. Some of them are aligned with God, and some of them are opposed to God. And again, that's pretty common for a first century Jew. I personally am less persuaded there's a cosmic battle going on that I can't see with all of these things. But I do know there are forces at work in the world that are way beyond my control, that are influencing how I want to spend my afternoon, what I'm going to spend my money on. Do you know what I mean? That's when I hear principalities or these other kinds of powers, I'm not interested in a roster of the demons in the world. I'm interested, again, in all of the things that are competing for my soul. And there's a sign that God's going to protect me from that, from my own algorithm.
So yeah,
Mark.
that's a powerful verse, I think, but I've always paired it with, well, not always, I've learned to pair it with the verse about the whole creation groans in travail, waiting for deliverance,
Yeah.
that even the principalities are an item of God's deliverance. And so it's a bit of a dialectic. They can be pretty bad, but they're not ultimately hopeless.
Right. This is where it's also interesting, as Doris keeps moving around the room, that some of this move in Judaism to a more kind of robust expectation of kind of demonic beings that are controlling things or that have power comes about during a time of also real imperial pressure being put on folks. And so you've got like the book of Daniel, who sees these different empires as monsters, to go back to monsters, as these hideous things that come out of the sea where chaos reigns. You've got the book of Revelation, which has some similar kinds of language there, this understanding that there is some oppression that's so severe that the way they imagine it is by these just hideous beasts that have some kind of control over the world. And again, that's a kind of personifying these powers, but nobody in the first century thinks they have power to change their world. Nobody in the Bible certainly does, except Jesus, but it just wasn't viewed like that. These are societies where the rich are controlled by all kinds of bigger cosmic powers that keep them under control. So I've read enough of people commenting on the book of Revelation who come out of oppressed communities, out of Croatia during the genocide in the 80s, out of South Africa as well, people saying like, yeah, this is how we viewed the system, right, as this demonic force that just was trying to kill us at every possible turn. So it's, again, a way that how does the language give voice to this reality and shape our imaginations? Betty, that was a long transition by me as the microphone
Well,
crossed
I'm sure
around.
you'll give the answer to this question in 10 words or less.
Nope.
So a movie that I still remember that scared the bejeebers out of me many years ago was The Exorcist.
I knew you guys, yeah.
So we've been talking about language, but this was actually people doing battle. And there are people who claim to do battle, that's their calling to do battle. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is, I'm sure there's a Roman Catholic exorcist in town. I'm sure at certain Pentecostal churches right now they're talking about spiritual warfare taking place and probably praying about the demons that are surrounding Westminster Presbyterian Church right now. There's some churches, are not all. I'm sure there are some churches in town who are praying that this morning. Luther had a healthy regard for the devil. For the most part, the Reformed tradition, where the Presbyterians sit, have really tried to avoid the devil in a lot of our history, in part because we're really worried about taking away accountability for sin and putting it on something else or somebody else. That's what the Ziegler book I find helpful. He's reformed as well, and he's trying to say it's time for reformed people to think again about evil. I get no share of what Ziegler makes off of his book. So it's just, again, it's kind of a way of what we understand the problem to be and how that's regarded. I'm very worried, to go back to that earlier slide about the morality of labeling everything demonic and having it. I think that starts to push away accountability and responsibility away from us, away from me, and onto something else or somebody else. I'm way more interested in talking about where does the sin in my own heart come from and how do I get rid of it. That's just me. This is my therapy session. But Todd.
Yeah, the mention of Exorcist, I saw that movie when I was way too young, and it ruined me. And I've reflected on that, and we mentioned rock and roll and the fascination that we have with that demonic language. And what I've come to believe is that people see that almost as a backdoor to faith, right? If there's evil, there must be good. And maybe that's just my spin on it, but it's a way to explain our society's fascination with evil.
Yeah.
We do see it. Evil's there. However it's personified or principalitied is another thing. But I tend to think that it's kind of our backdoor way to faith. As if there's evil, there must be an all-good God.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. I like that. You open up the fact that if we start asking around, people have got stories to tell about evil people, evil situations, evil things, which we don't like to talk about. We don't talk about this in polite company, and it's terrifying, like The Exorcist is.
Yesterday afternoon, I did a 2-hour webinar by Braver Angels on disagreeing better. And I come to the idea that maybe the terms far left and far right are attempts to extremize or demonize when it's not really a very accurate description of the truth of those people that hold positions that are being described that way. But I also stepped out because I went to the children's library and got this book, Where the Wild Things Are, and I'd never thought of it as metaphor until today. Thank you very much, man. I mean, go home and read it if you don't have it. Yeah. It's like amazing how much those monsters look like devils.
Thank you for that. It's 10:14. Bye to those on the live stream. Apparently, I'm preaching at 10:30, so I need to go in a minute. I was going to have us split into groups, but the large conversation felt to me like the way to go. There was good conversation. Hopefully, you weren't too bored. But if you're wondering what you missed, I was going to have half of you look at Luke 4, 1 through 13. This is one of the stories of the temptation scene. So if you're looking for something to do this afternoon, here's an example. And the other half of the group I was going to have look at Mark 5, 1 through 20. This is the man who's possessed by a legion of demons, is the language that he uses. This is a legion in the Roman military was like between 3,000 and 5,000 soldiers. It's this terrifying scene of a man who has to be restrained by chains. He lives out in the tombs. I mean, the city has essentially pushed him out to the edge because he's a harm to everybody else. He's a harm to himself, and he keeps breaking the chains, and they have to keep catching him and rechaining him, apparently. Which raises the question of what do you do when the demons are driven out of this man? And now everybody's terrified when they see him. But I had questions for these. If you're interested in those, you could always snap this with your camera and give you something to talk about on the drive home from church today. But that's where we were going to go. Next week, the topic is going to be conscience and freedom, which I was supposed to teach on last week, but pushed aside for other things. So we'll go back to that, kind of questions about how does the Bible talk about what does it mean to be free? What does that mean for our own sense of living in a free society and what we expect from that, but also what's the role of conscience and how we respect the consciences of one another and sometimes maybe even limit our freedom or try to make space in our freedom for people of various consciences. That's next week. So sorry to talk at you so much today, but anybody wants to talk more about this, let me know, just maybe not this second. Here's my concluding verse. Somebody mentioned Romans 8. Here's mine. Your obedience is known to all. This is Paul at the very end of the letter to the Romans. Therefore, I rejoice over you, but I want you to be wise in what is good and guileless in what is evil. I like that word, guileless, right? The God of peace will shortly crush Satan under your feet. That's a great image. The God of peace will shortly crush Satan under your feet. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you. In other words, Paul's final line here is one of hope and of God's concern for you, right? Of God's acknowledgement of the struggle that we live in a world that is sometimes morally very blurry and sometimes a dangerous place to live, and this notion that God still has battles to win, and great confidence that God does and will win those, to go back to the battle language. So I leave you with that and this image for next week, right? In case anybody's looking for some body art to get this week. There you go. All right. Thank you.